When Black people discover their Igbo identity, something extraordinary happens. Something that feels like an awakening, a remembering, a thunderstrike of truth cutting through centuries of silence. It is not just the discovery of a tribe, a lineage, or a distant history. It is the discovery of a long-buried mirror, a mirror that suddenly reflects strength, resilience, genius, and dignity that the world spent generations trying to bury. When a Jamaican, a Haitian, an African American, a Trinidadian, a Barbadian, or anyone across the Black diaspora learns that the rhythms in their heartbeat, the fierceness in their spirit, the defiance in their survival, and the depth in their intuition can be traced to the ancient Igbo world, something shifts inside them, something ancient stands upright. Because the Igbo identity is not just a cultural label, it is a message encoded in the bones, a memory whispered through generations, a story carried by blood that refused to disappear despite ships, shackles, plantations, and empires. The moment a Black person discovers their Igbo ancestry, a door swings open to an entire civilization they never knew belonged to them. A civilization of world builders, philosophers, merchants, astronomers, inventors, diplomats, warriors, and spiritual thinkers who once walked the forests of the Niger River with the same confidence that royalty walks through palaces. Suddenly, the narrative begins to change. The person begins to realize that the courage they carry is not accidental. The creativity they possess is not random. Their ability to rise from suffering is not simply personality, it is inheritance. It is something that was shaped before they were born, shaped by ancestors who built republics without kings, democracies without crowns, economies without empires, systems of justice without prisons, and spiritual philosophies without fear. When Black people uncover their Igbo identity, they realize why they have always possessed a certain restlessness, a certain refusal to bow, a certain fire that even oppression could not extinguish. Because the Igbo were known as a people who would rather leap into water than kneel to tyranny, a people whose name Igbo became synonymous with unbreakable, a people who carried rebellion in their bones the way others carried breath in their lungs. And suddenly the diaspora begins to understand why their ancestors on Caribbean plantations became maroons, insurgents, liberators, healers, and leaders. They begin to understand why so many enslaved people spoke with a proud straightness in their back, why they fought for literacy, for freedom, for land, for dignity. They begin to understand why resistance was not the exception, it was the inheritance. And when a Black person discovers this truth today in the modern world, it does something to their mind. It rewrites the script they were given. They stop seeing themselves through the eyes of oppression and start seeing themselves through the eyes of ancestors. They stop believing the lie that their story started on a plantation and begin to understand that their story started in a civilization older than the British Empire, older than the French crown, older than American history, older than the very borders that tried to erase Africa's memory. The discovery of Igbo identity plants something powerful in the soul, a sense of belonging that no racist, no government, no institution, and no system can ever take away again. Because suddenly Black people realize that their bloodline is not scattered, it is unified. It is not lost, it is interrupted, it is not broken, it is waiting, reclaimed. And when they reclaim it, their walk changes, their voice changes, their dreams change, their expectations change. They begin to feel like they owe their ancestors greatness, not because of pressure but because of gratitude. They begin to dream bigger because they understand that their ancestors were not small people. They were giants disguised as farmers, visionaries disguised as villagers, astronomers disguised as diviners, inventors disguised as craftsmen. They begin to understand that the diaspora's brilliance today, whether in music, sports, science, activism, literature, or leadership, is not a coincidence, it is a continuation. And suddenly the scattered pieces begin to connect the way Caribbean languages echo Igbo idiom, the way African American food echoes Igbo flavors, the way Haitian proverbs echo Igbo wisdom, the way Jamaican spirituality echoes Igbo cosmology, the way diaspora culture echoes Igbo symbolism without ever having been taught. Black people begin to understand that what survived the Middle Passage was not just bodies, it was memory, a memory that hid inside laughter, inside rhythm, inside naming traditions, inside the urge to gather in community, inside the instinct to protect each other, inside the drive to rebuild after destruction. And when this memory is named, when someone says this is Igbo, Black people begin to understand why so many across the diaspora feel like they have been searching for something all their lives, because this identity fills a lifelong silence, answers a centuries-old question, heals a wound they were born with, and stitches together the fragmented pages of a stolen history. It gives them something the world never wanted them to have: context. And context is power. Context tells a Black child that their worth is older than slavery. It tells a Black teenager that their intelligence is not exceptional, it is ancestral. It tells a Black adult that their endurance is not personal, it is culture. And when this understanding deepens, something else happens. Responsibility awakens, because identity is not just discovery, it is duty. The moment a Black person discovers their Igbo identity, they begin to feel responsible for the story that was attempted to be erased. They begin to feel responsible for reclaiming, teaching, protecting, rebuilding, and elevating what was nearly lost. They feel responsible for carrying the names that colonizers tried to bury, for preserving the languages that ships tried to drown, for honoring the ancestors who refused to let their identity die even as they faced the darkest chapters of human history. And then something even greater happens. Unity grows, because Igbo identity does not divide the diaspora, it connects it. It reveals that the Caribbean, America, South America, and Africa are not separate stories. They are one story written in different places. It reveals that the descendants of those taken and the descendants of those who remained are not strangers. They are families separated by force. It reveals that the diaspora is not the end of Africa, it is Africa extended. And when Black people discover this truth, they begin to walk like people who have found home again. They begin to speak with a confidence that even colonizers could not teach. They begin to heal wounds that even time could not mend. They begin to look at themselves with new vision, new strength, and new pride. Because discovering one's Igbo identity is discovering that you come from a people who refused to die, who refused to surrender, who refused to be erased. And if they could survive everything they faced, then you can survive everything you face too. And that is the power of identity. That is the power of memory. That is the power of knowing who you truly are. Because when Black people finally discover their Igbo identity, they don't just learn history, they become unstoppable. When a Black person learns they descend from Igbo rebels, their spirit finally understands its own fire, because suddenly the questions they carried in silence begin to find their answers in the memory of a people who refused to be broken. For generations, Black families across the Americas felt an unexplainable intensity inside them, an instinct toward freedom, a restlessness with oppression, a boldness that rises even when everything around them tries to push them down. Many never knew that this fire did not begin with them. It was inherited, passed down from ancestors who were known across West Africa as the ones who would rather die than lose their dignity. When the truth finally reaches a Black person that they come from a lineage that terrified slave traders because of their discipline, their unity, and their refusal to bow, it activates something powerful within them, something ancient, something that was waiting for the right moment to be recognized. It is not just a discovery of heritage, it is the awakening of identity, the unlocking of memory, and the realization that the strength they always carried was not random, but inherited from a people whose entire culture was built on self-respect, justice, and unshakable courage. The moment this identity surfaces, the world around them begins to make more sense. Suddenly the stubbornness they were criticized for becomes a reminder of the Igbo refusal to surrender. The compassion they were mocked for becomes a reflection of an Igbo culture built on community, fairness, and shared humanity. The desire for independence, economic independence, spiritual independence, personal independence stops feeling like rebellion and starts feeling like inheritance. They realize that the echo they felt inside their chest was not anger but memory, not arrogance but legacy, not pride but recognition. For centuries, the Igbo were intentionally erased from American and Caribbean history books because colonizers feared what knowledge of that ancestry would do for Black mind. They feared that if Black people ever learned they came from a nation where every individual was trained to think independently, speak boldly, and resist injustice fiercely, then the entire foundation of oppression would collapse. And that is exactly what begins to happen the moment a Black person learns where their fire comes from. This discovery shakes generations because Igbo identity was not built on hierarchy or kings but on a system where everyone had a voice, a vote, a responsibility, and a sense of personal value. So when a Black person in America Jamaica, Haiti, Brazil, or Trinidad learns that their ancestors came from one of the most democratic, community-driven, justice-centered cultures in West Africa, they begin to view themselves differently. They begin to understand why their spirit never accepted silence, why their soul never tolerated injustice, why their mind always sought deeper truth. It explains why their creativity is so naturally strong, why their leadership shows up even when they try to dim it, and why their resilience feels like an instinct rather than a skill. Once they learn they descend from Igbo rebels, they stop apologizing for their fire and start mastering. For too long, black people were told they were broken, lost, disconnected, and without identity, but the moment an Igbo connection is revealed, that narrative collapses. They begin to see that they did not lose their identity, it survived inside them, waiting to be unlocked. They begin to see that their boldness is not a flaw but a fingerprint. They realize that their ancestors were not weak servants but powerful resistors whose revolts shook entire plantations, whose escapes carved new paths of defiance, and whose spiritual strength helped shape the backbone of black culture across the diaspora. They start understanding why certain values run deeply in black families. The importance of community, the love for music and rhythm, the reverence for ancestors, the instinct to gather, the need to uplift each other, the sense of dignity even in the face of struggle. These are not coincidences, they are echoes. And when this awakening happens, something shifts permanently. A black person begins to walk differently, speak differently, move differently, because they are no longer operating from confusion, they are operating from memory. They are no longer trying to fit into the world's expectations. They are stepping into the shape their ancestors already carved for them. They begin to understand that the fire inside them is not a reaction to life but a continuation of a lineage that carried courage like a weapon and purpose like a crown. It becomes impossible to see themselves as small once they learn they come from a people who shaped their destiny with their own hands. It becomes impossible to see themselves as powerless once they realize they come from a tribe whose spirit refuses chains, refuses silence, refuses defeat. When a black person learns they descend from Igbo rebels, their whole being rises because knowledge of ancestry is not just information, it is ignition. It is the moment the heart recognizes itself. It is the moment the blood remembers. It is the moment the forgotten flame bursts into its full brightness. And from that moment on, they no longer live as someone searching for identity. They live as someone carrying it boldly, fiercely, fearlessly, because they now understand the truth that was hidden from them for centuries. Their fire did not start with them and it will not end with them. It is eternal, passed from ancestor to descendant, waiting for each generation to rediscover its power. When black people finally awaken to their Igbo identity, something far deeper than simple historical awareness rises within them. It is as if a locked chamber in the collective soul swings open, releasing memories, instincts, and emotional hurtles that have been buried for centuries yet never died. Across Jamaica, Haiti, Brazil, America, and every corner of the diaspora, there is a strange familiarity, a rhythm in the heartbeat, a dignity in the walk, a fire in the spirit that mirrors the ancient character of the Igbo people. And when this recognition finally comes to light, it is like hearing your name shouted across time. For generations, colonial systems, forced assimilation and cultural erasure were designed to silence that inner call, to disconnect millions from the very source of their identity. But identity is not a garment that can be stripped off. It is a vibration written into bone, blood, and breath. The moment a black person looks into Igbo history and sees themselves reflected in the courage of the elders, the democratic traditions of the clans, the stubborn resilience of the ancestors, a thunder breaks inside them. They begin to understand why certain values, certain behaviors, certain instincts survived the Middle Passage, even when languages, kingdoms, and homelands were stolen. They begin to realize that nothing about them is random. Their confidence, their creativity, their spirituality, their refusal to bow, these are inherited echoes of a people who believed every human carried divine worth, who built societies without kings because they trusted the wisdom of the community, who practiced a freedom so deep that even slavery could not entirely snuff it out. When a black person discovers they may be carrying Igbo roots, they suddenly understand why their grandparents raised them the way they did, why certain proverbs sound familiar even though they never learned them, why certain moral systems feel natural in their bones. It explains why the fight for liberation is instinctual, why resistance flows through the diaspora like an unbroken river. It explains why Jamaica's Maroons fought like warriors who refused to kneel, why Haiti's revolutionaries carried a supernatural defiance, why African Americans found ways to build unity against impossible odds. These were not coincidences, they were ancestral fingerprints. And when that realization dawns, a sense of healing begins, not just personal healing but collective healing. Entire families start unveiling stories that elders never fully understood but always felt. Mysteries about temperament, dreams, and inner calling start making sense. Cultural practices that seem disconnected suddenly find roots. The fear of embracing African identity, a fear planted by generations of colonial conditioning, begins to melt away. In its place rises pride, clarity, and a sense of belonging that cannot be bought or taught. It can only be remembered. The discovery awakens a sense of responsibility. When Black people recognize their Igbo lineage, they begin to value education, community leadership, dignity, and unity in a different way because they now understand these principles as inherited obligations. They stop seeing themselves as descendants of enslaved people and start seeing themselves as descendants of a highly structured, spiritually sophisticated, intellectually advanced society that the world tried to erase. And when you know where you come from, you become dangerous to any system built on your confusion. The awakening also ignites creativity. Artists, writers, musicians, and storytellers start drawing from a deeper well. Activists start speaking with a sharper sense of purpose. Parents start raising their children with a clearer understanding of identity. The shame that colonial education forced onto African heritage begins to crumble, replaced by a shining pride that strengthens the entire diaspora. Even people who are not Igbo by blood but feel spiritually or culturally connected begin to find empowerment in the philosophical values of the Igbo worldview, values of equality, justice, communal support, and unshakable resilience. Because the truth is, Igbo identity is not only a lineage, it is a consciousness. And when that consciousness wakes up inside Black people, it does not rise quietly. It rises like a drum that has been waiting for centuries to be struck again. It rises like a name forgotten but never erased. It rises like a homeland calling its children back through memory, through intuition, through the soul's deepest longing to know itself. And once that awakening begins, it cannot be undone. A generation once lost finds its reflection. A people once scattered recognize themselves in one another. Generational silence shatters. Ancestral memory rises, and the diaspora steps into its power not as fragmented communities, but as one people whose story began long before slavery, and whose future will be written with the full knowledge of who they truly are. Across Jamaica, Haiti, America, and the Caribbean, Igbo identity isn't returning. It is re-emerging from within the blood, rising like a long-buried drumbeat that never lost its rhythm, only its language, only its name, only its memory of home. And when you look closely at the history of these lands, you realize that this re-emergence is not an accident or a coincidence. It is the natural unfolding of a truth that survived chains, ships, plantations, revolts, and centuries of silence. Because the Igbo spirit was never something that could be removed by distance or erased by force. It was carried in the behavior, the stubborn resilience, the defiant laughter, the style of leadership, the family structures, the spirituality, the music, the proverbs, the rhythm of survival, the courage to rebuild, and the way Black people across these regions instinctively rise again and again, even when the world expects them to fall. In Jamaica, you see it in the Maroons who resisted domination with strategies that mirrored Igbo warrior society. In Haiti, you see it in the revolution that shook the world, echoing the Igbo belief that no force is greater than a free human spirit. In African America, you see it in the quiet dignity of elders, the assertive dignity of youth, the irrepressible hunger for self-definition, and the cultural refusal to be anything less than powerful. The reemergence is not an introduction to something new. It is a recognition of something ancient that many didn't know they carried. When people across these regions learn about the Igbo, something inside them reacts not with confusion, but with familiarity. Like remembering a melody you have hummed your entire life without knowing its name. That reaction is not just intellectual, it is emotional, instinctive, cellular. Because the Igbo identity was never fully lost, it simply traveled underground through customs, beliefs, and expressions that didn't need a name to survive. You see it in Jamaican patois words that trace back to Igbo. You see it in Haitian social structures that mirror Igbo lineage systems. You see it in African American naming traditions, family hierarchies, and the deep culture of mutual aid that reflects centuries of Igbo communal value. The echo resonates in the rhythm of Caribbean and Black American speech, the tonal quality, the storytelling cadence, the spiritual worldview that connects human beings with destiny and purpose. These echoes are not coincidences. They are cultural footprints that survived everything meant to erase them. And when modern Black people discover these footprints, the reemergence begins to move from instinct to awareness, from silent memory to conscious identity. The powerful truth is this: Igbo identity is not returning. It never left. It simply went unnamed. It moved through the bodies of ancestors who refused to break. It moved through the determination of enslaved people who preserved fragments of home, even when they could not speak their language. It moved through liberation fighters who carried symbols from their ancestral cultures without knowing what they meant. It moved through generations of Black families who developed a collective psychology that mirrors what the Igbo people have displayed for thousands of years: independence, resilience, innovation, adaptability, entrepreneurial instinct, and obsession with freedom. And now that historical research is growing, DNA testing is expanding, and cultural education is spreading, these unconscious echoes are finally gaining vocabulary. People are discovering that traits they thought were random are actually rooted in an ancient identity. People are learning that their boldness, their family pride, their instinct to lead, their refusal to be dominated, their deep spirituality, and their sense of destiny all mirror the behavior of Igbo societies in pre-colonial West Africa. They are discovering that the echoes in their blood have names, origins, and history. What makes this reemergence so powerful is that it is not based on fantasy. It is grounded in historical migration patterns, documented slave ship records, linguistic research, cultural analysis, and genetic data that show clear connections between Igbo populations and Black descendants throughout the Americas. Yet the most striking part is that these communities did not need textbooks to carry their heritage. They embodied it. They lived. Even the rebellions that shaped Caribbean and American history mirrored Igbo philosophies of resistance. Even the music, reggae, dancehall, blues, gospel, Haitian folk rhythms, carry the same tonal structures as Igbo music. Even the value systems, respect for elders, communal responsibility, emphasis on personal achievement, reflect the exact worldview that has guided the Igbo people for centuries. The reemergence of Igbo identity across Jamaica, Haiti, America, and the Caribbean is not about placing one African ethnic group above another. It is about uncovering one of the many powerful roots that shape Black global identity. It is about recognizing that the African diaspora is not a mystery without answers, but a puzzle whose pieces are finally coming together. And when people reconnect these pieces, the psychological shift is enormous. The shame that slavery tried to impose begins to dissolve when identity becomes clear. The confusion that colonization imposed begins to lift when heritage becomes visible. The uncertainty that displacement created begins to fade when ancestral memory returns. Because when a person finally discovers where their strength comes from, they stop doubting themselves. When a people learn the origin of their courage, they stop underestimating their power. When a community realizes that their cultural traits are not random but inherited, they stand tall. And when Black people across Jamaica, Haiti, America, and the Caribbean reclaim the truth that Igbo echoes live within them, a new self-awareness rises, one built not on trauma but on pride, not on loss but on rediscovery, not on brokenness but on continuity. That is why the reemergence matters, not because it changes the past but because it transforms how the present generation understands itself and how the next generation will walk into the future.